Hello, everyone. We are Group 8. I'm Celine Gu and joined by Yanting Wang, Xiaorui Zheng, Zihe Hao, Yiyang Xu. Our case study focuses on the veteran suicide issue that has came into public notice in recent years. Suicide in the US is a major national health issue. According to CDC, there were over 45,000 suicides in 2018, which is about 125 individuals a single day. The suicide rate has increased steadily by 30% nationally since 2000. Veterans specifically has higher suicide rate compared to the rest of population. The suicide rate for veterans is 1.5 times greater than the rate for non-veteran adults. There are a few reasons here. A lot of veterans don't seek help. Trained medical experts have trouble identifying people who are at high risk. Government has limited budget in helping veterans. In order to improve this situation, the Department of Veterans Affairs has turned to machine learning to assist the current system on detecting veterans who are at high risk of taking their own lives. The New York Times article titled Can an Algorithm Prevent Suicide provides a nuanced insight in terms of using AI to predict the possibility of veteran suicide risk. The data we will use is a cross-sectional dataset. We observe each veteran along with their personal information to build a model connecting explanatory factors with the possibility of the veteran committing suicide within a time period. Based on previous stats, there are rate differences depending on demographic features such as age, gender, ethnicity, and race. Veterans with age of 50 or older has higher percentage of committing suicide. Females are 1.5 times more often than males. Some other independent variables like marital status, employment status, socioeconomic status explain part of the reasons how their stressors come from. Besides, factor variables such as hospital visits, diagnosis, incidents of substance abuse, prescription history are directly related to suicide risk. Previous suicide attempt is another critical factor. People who have committed suicide before are very likely to do it again without effective medical interference. We will go over the details of these factors in our later presentation. So just to give a brief preview on how our data look like.
So now after the brief introduction, let's now talk about the model used in this algorithm. So to better diagnose whether a veteran has the intention to commit suicide, the algorithm draws from thousands of previous suicides in the VA's database. Then the algorithm selects 61 predictors that are most correlated with the suicide risk. In this predictor selection process, the program uses a backward selection method to choose those most associated factors from a larger set of personal features. We can categorize those 61 predictors into three main groups. The first group is numerical variables, which includes age, income, and years of enlistment. The second group of predictors is vector variables, including a veteran's sex, marital status, health diagnosis, prescription history, past suicide attempts, and hospital visits, etc. Besides, the model includes three interactions to more accurately capture the effect of the predictors. Also, the algorithm runs a specification test to assess whether the functional form for predictor in the current model is appropriate. The outcome variable generated by this algorithm is a complete score for each veteran observation, that this score will measure the probability of committing suicide. In order to generate a direct representation of probability, the score is normalized from 0 to 1. Therefore, based on the characteristics and goals of this algorithm, the largest model is the most appropriate choice. The program manager can choose a specific probability as a threshold that a person with a higher score would be diagnosed with positive, which means that person have the potential to commit suicide. People with lower grades would be grouped as negative, which indicates that they don't have the high potential to commit suicide. The direct diagnosis results allow VA services to specialize their care enhancement more to the positive group than to those with relatively lower grade. Since the result generated by the largest model is a specific number for each observation, it is also possible for the VA services to target the group whose score is among the top 0.1% and flag this group as a high risk. The model updates monthly with the most current information, so the veteran's risk level can be tracked on a monthly basis. After the VA services group get a new list of the high-risk people, the service group can then provide immediate medical interventions and health monitoring to this group and thus prevent future possible suicides. Also, considering the essence of this algorithm and the effect the outcome can have, the accuracy of this model ought to be thoroughly assessed before its implementation in the real service center. Since false positives can bring stigma to the vulnerable group, while false negatives may lead to failure in preventing suicide. Thus, as a model built on the database of previous suicide samples, the programmer can use the cross-validation method, specifically the k-fold cross-validation method, to evaluate the performance of the model they have. After splitting the dataset into training and test datasets, the system then applies the model generated on the training dataset to the test dataset in order to generate the model with the most appropriate flexibility. The cross-validation method will improve the predictive ability of the model, and in consequence, the VA service can better allocate medical resources and provide in-time therapies to the truly risky group.
The result shows that people who score at the top 0.1% are predicted to be 40 times more likely to die of suicide than the average person. According to the outcome generated by the RichVet system, these individuals are 33 times more likely to suicide based on 1 month data, 15 times more likely to suicide, and 81 times more likely to have a suicide attempt based on 1 year data. In addition, they also have a higher probability of die of other non-suicide external causes, such as accidents, injuries, violence, etc., and they're more likely to receive different kinds of inpatient bed days of care. The application of the system also leads to unexpected results. While the strongest risk factor for suicide is considered to be a previous attempt with a gun, an individual who has a high suspicion of having had such experience is not on a high-risk list created by the AI algorithm. Nevertheless, the RichVet system turned out to have plentiful advantages. One immediate benefit is that the system increased the accuracy in predicting individual suicide risk. Compared to the criteria used by doctors, the RichVet system can take account of much more factors that may be easily overlooked but are associated with the risk. In this way, the system provides a much more accurate analysis of individuals' risk than that of experts. In addition, the system increased the number of veterans that use VA services. According to the first result presented by a VA team, high-risk veterans more than doubled their use of VA services in contrast to a comparison group. Based on the information regarding the high-risk individuals, the RichVet group will assign coordinators that assist with healthcare services and primary care providers that reach out to the veterans. According to the matrix on the right, from 2017 to 2018, the assigned coordinator increased from roughly 80% to 97%, while the provider assigned increased from 67% to 89%. Furthermore, the RichVet group assesses and records the system's effect on patient outcomes as the care evaluation performed. In the matrix, this value also largely increased. These results demonstrate that the system effectively increased the number of veterans willing to receive care and support from VA services. Furthermore, it decreases the mortality rate of individuals that use it. By exposing the issue of many veterans' reluctance to seek help on their own, the system also encourages doctors to reconsider and come up with a more appropriate strategy to measure the potential suicide risk. Even though the system fails to provide the most beneficial way to apply interventions, it manages to detect the veterans with a high risk of suicide, encourages more of them to use VA services, and more importantly, it effectively decreases the suicide rate among those veterans.
So for inference applications, first of all, let's discuss some of the shortcomings of this model. Our model, like all other classification models, has false positives and false negative issues. Now, unlike other classifications where we only care about either false positive or negatives, like for a COVID test, we only care about false negatives. Here we have a little bit of penalty for both false positive and false negatives. Now, if you look at what our model is doing right now, we're gonna see that our threshold is actually very, very high because each day there are more than 100 people in the US committing suicide, but our model only lists 100 people or so on a rolling basis. That means our model is only identifying the most vulnerable group of veterans in that regard. So realistically, we are having a lot of false negatives, meaning that we're missing a lot of suicide attempts by veterans that who attempted suicide, but our model didn't record or didn't predict those. So that said, our model does have a very high threshold because first of all, there are limited fundings on this project, but also we don't want that many false positives either. So if you look at this, if we increase the threshold, so realistically, our threshold is going to be very, very high, like something like 0.8 or 0.9%. If we increase the threshold to this level, then we are going to have a lot of false negatives, but our false positive rates is going to be very low. That means that we won't be predicting suicide attempts that actually didn't happen. Therefore, our sensibility to suicide in the prevention process is going to be kept at a very high level. So our personnel will be very vigilant when preventing those suicides. And some potential applications directly from this model include looking at some of the numbers that our model has generated and applying them into some immediate practical circumstances. And that includes two things. First of all, is using this model to evaluate the already existing suicide prevention programs. So what we will do here is that before and after the program, we're gonna have different kinds of data about the personnel. And from those data, when we plug those data into this model, this already trained model, it's gonna give us the suicide tendencies before and after treatment. And it's gonna be a very nice way to actually quantify the effectiveness of the prevention programs and to evaluate how exactly how effective those programs are. And it's a very good way to improve those programs in a very tangible way. And another way to apply this program is to directly identify some of the most significant stressors that our model has provided us with and implementing those into the programs that we have. This will be done by looking at the coefficients within the model, namely for probit or logit that we are using, is to look at the marginal effects and average those out for each of the variables. For instance, like gun possession, we're going to look at how much more probable are people to commit suicide with respect to gun possession. On average, we're going to compute the marginal effects, the average of all people, and we're going to look at the effect of gun possession. And from those things, we can maybe decide whether gun possessions are relatively less important compared to other stressors or more important, but this comes down to the actual data. But there are some problems still with these applications. That is, our program were meant to be predictive and preventative of actual suicides, but it's not going to be very good at explaining exactly how factors affect suicide. And one of the biggest problems here is going to be that our model uses the previous attempt data way too much. And because in the article, it said that one of the most dominant features that the model uses to predict suicide tendencies is this previous attempt variable, which is going to be very good at predicting suicide attempts, but it's not very explanatory of the reasons behind the suicide. And this in the model is going to put less weight into the other factors that we may actually care very much about when it comes to practical applications. So if our weight in these important factors are undermined, it's going to be harder for us to identify these more important stressors because they're going to seem less important in the model. And it's also going to be very difficult using these to evaluate existing programs, because if you have existing programs helping those who have attempted suicide before, then this data will not change no matter how we help these people. And we're going to have to impose some sort of penalty on previous attempt to make it to make our model less dependent on this variable than before.
Now, let us come to the conclusion part. In general, our model has brought a lot of benefits to veteran suicide prevention. With the use of algorithm, we have higher accuracy when predicting people with a high risk of committing suicide. Compared to human doctors, the model can analyze many more variables. As we cover those variables which have been overlooked for a long time, the accuracy of predictions increases, and some unexpected results were also generated from the analysis. According to traditional view of point, a previous attack with a gun is recognized as the leading risk factor for suicide. But many individuals with such experience were not contained in the high-risk list created by AI. Increasing predicting power is not only thing that this model can do. According to a comparison, the model increases the number of veterans using VA service. At the same time, the mortality rate of veterans using service will also reduce. For veteran suicide issues, we believe that the only health support is not enough. Through the research, it turns out that employment number of children, and even age are all important factors which have a strong influence on veteran suicide. Therefore, our government should definitely allocate enough resources to career training and retirement homes to ensure that veterans can live a dignified life after leaving the military. And in the future, this model can also be applied to some other fields, such as violence, accidents, and overdoses. Since it can predict the probability of suicide for veterans, it can also be used in some other groups with similar risks. Using violence crime as an example, we can just use a similar model to analyze how different factors contribute to, for example, bomb attacking, and mass shooting based on dataset provided by FBI and state police. After that, more attention can be paid by police to those highly risky individuals. Hundreds of lives might be saved through those measures. Here is the work we cited, and thank you so much for listening.